Welcome back to Citadel Stories. Today we're going to follow the full story of Ser Duncan the Tall and his young squire, Egg, a pair of unlikely companions whose travels would eventually shape the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. Set nearly a century before the events of A Song of Ice and Fire, their journey begins with a hedge knight and a mysterious boy on the road, and leads through tournaments, rebellions, and encounters with some of the most powerful figures in Westeros. In this video, we'll be exploring the complete story of Dunk and Egg, from their first meeting all the way through the adventures that made them legends in their own time. So settle in and prepare to journey back to a different era of Westeros, and the story of a hedge knight, a hidden prince, and the road that changed them both. The Hedge Knight, the complete story of Dunk and Egg. Section 1. The World Before the Storm. Before the dragons died, before the Mad King burned his enemies alive in their own armor, before Robert's rebellion tore the realm in two, there was a gentler Westeros, or at least a more hopeful one. We are stepping back nearly a century before the events of A Song of Ice and Fire. The year is approximately 209 AC, after the conquest. The Targaryens still sit the Iron Throne, as they have for over 200 years, but their dragons are long gone now, the last of them dying decades prior, their bones resting beneath the Red Keep. Without dragons, the Targaryens are still kings, but they are kings made of flesh and blood, just like any other, and flesh bleeds. The realm is not at war when our story begins, but it carries the memory of war in its bones. Just 15 years earlier, the Dance of the Dragons had nearly shattered the dynasty from within. That was a civil war of the worst kind. Brother against sister, dragon against dragon, Targaryen against Targaryen. When it ended, the family had survived, but barely. The dragons were gone, the succession was muddied, and the great lords of Westeros had learned something dangerous, that the crown could bleed. By 209 AC, the Iron Throne is held by King Aegon II, called Aegon the Good, a man who united the Seven Kingdoms through diplomacy rather than fire, who brought Dawn into the fold through marriage rather than conquest. He is a wise king, a careful king, but he is old, and he has sons, and his sons have sons, and the question of which blood is truest and which claim is strongest has never entirely gone away. This is the world into which our story walks. And the man who walks into it is about as far from a king as you can get. Section 2. The Big Man with No Name. His name, his full name, is Ser Duncan the Tall, but when we first meet him, he isn't even that. He is simply a hedge knight squire, a boy of no particular family and no particular prospects, trudging down a dusty road somewhere in the Reach. He is enormous. That much is clear immediately, tall enough that people assume he must be a warrior, must be dangerous, must have some history behind that size. But Duncan is young, probably 16 or 17, though he isn't entirely sure himself. And his history is thin. He grew up in Flea Bottom, the worst slum in King's Landing. He has no family he can name, no lord who claimed him, no house that shaped him. What he has is a knight named Arlen of Pennytree who took him in off the street and gave him work and eventually something like purpose. But Sir Arlen of Pennytree is dead. He died of a chill in the hills, quiet and undramatic, the way old men die when the world has already forgotten them. And he left Duncan with almost nothing. A horse named Thunder, a sword, a suit of armor that doesn't quite fit, a shield with a faded elm tree on it, and the memory of everything Arlen taught him. Duncan buries his mentor with his own hands, and then he faces a choice that will define the rest of his life. He could go back, find work as a man-at-arms or a mercenary, or perhaps attach himself to some lord's household as a servant. That would be the safe road, the humble road. Instead, Duncan decides he is going to be a knight. He has no papers of ennoblement. No lord ever touched a sword to his shoulders and said the words. He is not technically a knight by the laws of the Seven Kingdoms. What he is, what he tells himself, is that Arlen was going to knight him, that the old man would have done it if he'd lived, that the intention is enough. Whether that counts is a question the story will return to. But Duncan has made up his mind, and a man of Duncan's size and stubbornness, once he's made up his mind, is very difficult to redirect. He paints over the elm tree on his shield. He doesn't feel he's earned the right to carry Arlen's sigil. And he heads toward Ashford Meadow, where a great tournament is to be held in honor of Lord Ashford's daughter. Tournaments mean prize money. Prize money means a hedge knight can eat. Section 3. The Boy in the Stables. The road to Ashford is long, and Duncan travels it mostly alone. He is not eloquent, he is not quick. He thinks slowly and carefully, and sometimes he thinks wrong, but he is earnest in a way that is almost painful to watch. A boy trying very hard to be a man, wearing a dead man's armor. He stops to camp in the wilderness, and that is where he finds the boy. The boy is perhaps 10 years old, small and slight, with short pale hair and bright purple eyes. He claims his name is Egg. He has apparently been dismissed from service with another knight, or perhaps he left on his own. The story isn't quite clear at first. And he wants to squire for Duncan. Duncan does not want a squire. He barely has food for himself. He refuses. The boy follows him anyway. There is something immediately funny and immediately poignant about their first interactions. Duncan is twice the boy's size and probably twice his age, and yet somehow Egg gets under his skin with a persistence that borders on supernatural. He does chores without being asked. He takes care of Thunder without being told. He asks questions constantly about knighthood and honor and what it means to be a true knight, and some of those questions Duncan doesn't have answers to, which bothers him more than the questions themselves. Eventually Duncan relents. He doesn't have money to pay a squire. He doesn't have anything to offer, really, but Egg doesn't seem to want payment. He wants to learn. What Duncan doesn't know, what he won't know for some time, is exactly who this boy is. Egg is short for Aegon, and Aegon is the fourth son of Prince Maekar Targaryen, himself the fourth son of King Daeron II. In other words, the boy serving as Duncan's squire, sleeping rough under the stars and mucking out a horse's stall, is a prince of the blood royal of House Targaryen, and he has absolutely no intention of telling Duncan this if he can help it. Section 4. Ashford and the Rules of the Game. They arrive at Ashford Meadow, and it is everything a hedge knight dreams of. Banners everywhere, the golden rose of the Tyrrells, the stars of the Fossaway family, the silver fish of House Tully, the purple of House Ashford itself. Knights in bright armour, squires polishing steel, ladies in the stands, the smell of roasting meat and fresh-cut grass. The tournament at Ashford has a particular structure, one that will become very important. Rather than a general melee or a standard joust where anyone can challenge anyone, Lord Ashford has decided to run what's called a tournament of love. 5 champions are selected to defend the honor of Lord Ashford's daughter. Each one wears her favor. Any challenger who wishes to joust must declare which champion he intends to unseat. If the champion wins, the challenger is out. If the challenger wins, he takes the defeated knight's place among the five. It is a beautiful and elegant format, designed to produce clear winners and dramatic confrontations. It will also, in the end, lead to something very close to catastrophe. The five champions are notable men, among them Prince Valar, the grandson of the king himself, and Prince Aerion, a Targaryen prince of rather more volatile temperament. The field sparkles with noble names. Duncan is not among them. He is a hedge knight. He is nobody. He watches the first day of competition from the sides, and he watches badly, because watching the jousting reminds him of everything he doesn't have, and everything he wants, and how far apart those two things are. And then something happens that changes the course of everything. Section 5. The Matter of the Puppeteer's Girl. On the edge of the tournament grounds, among the merchants and entertainers who always follow these great gatherings, there is a puppeteer named Steely Pate, who performs shows with little carved wooden figures, and with him is a young woman named Tanselle Too Tall, people call her, which Duncan finds charming in a way he can't quite articulate, perhaps because he knows something about being called too tall. Tanselle is an artist. She paints and sews and crafts things with obvious skill. She and Duncan talk in that awkward way of two people who find each other interesting and aren't sure what to do about it. He watches her perform. She watches him joust. There is something genuinely sweet about it. And then Prince Aerion gets involved. Aerion Targaryen is called Aerion Brightflame, and the name is not ironic. He believes it genuinely. He is handsome, silver-haired, and possessed of a cruelty that he mistakes for strength and a vanity he mistakes for pride. He is, by any honest reckoning, a dangerous man, not because he is especially formidable in combat, but because he is unpredictable and vicious in the way that people who have never faced real consequences tend to be. During one of Tanselle's puppet shows, she performs a bit of theatrical comedy in which a dragon is defeated by a knight, a common enough story, a staple of mummery. The audience laughs. Aerion does not laugh. Aerion sees the puppet dragon as an insult to his house, to House Targaryen, to himself. He attacks the puppeteers, he destroys their props, and then he takes Tanselle and stamps on her fingers, her hands, her livelihood, the tools of everything she is, with a deliberate, grinding cruelty that is meant to humiliate as much as harm. Duncan sees this, and Duncan does something that any sensible man in his position would know not to do. He intervenes. He pulls Aerion off Tanselle. He hits a prince of the blood. He commits, in the eyes of the law of the Seven Kingdoms, an act that could cost him his hand, or his head, or both. Section 6. The Trial of Seven. What follows is a confrontation with the cold machinery of power. Aerion and his brother Daeron the drunk they call him, a gentler if dissolute soul, bring charges against Duncan. In Westerosi law, a man accused of striking a prince has limited options. He can confess and accept punishment. He can appeal to the king's justice, which is effectively the same thing, or he can demand a trial. A trial by combat, 7 against 7, Duncan demands it. This is either very brave or very stupid, and Duncan is self-aware enough to suspect it might be both. A trial of 7, sometimes called an appeal to the gods through battle, requires each side to field exactly 7 knights. The gods, presumably, will ensure the just side wins. This is the theory. The practice is that Duncan needs to find 6 knights willing to stand beside a hedge knight of no name against members of the royal family. This is, to put it gently, not a popular position to be in. Most knights refuse. The Targaryens are the royal house. Aerion is a prince. standing against princes on behalf of a nobody, even if the nobody is right, is the kind of thing that ends careers and sometimes heads. But slowly, improbably, Duncan's Seven takes shape. Sir Robin Riesling, an elderly knight who has lived long enough to stop caring about consequences. Sir Lionel Baratheon, a young lord's son who believes in justice more than politics. Sir Humphrey Beesbury and Sir Humphrey Harding, two men of good conscience who cannot watch an innocent woman be harmed without speaking. And then, at the last moment, two more who matter enormously. The first is Sir Steffon Fossaway, the wrong Fossaway, as it turns out. The family has a dispute, and he stands apart from his cousin. The second is Sir Raymond Fossaway, who, shamed by seeing his cousin choose right while he hesitated, comes forward at nearly the last moment. And then there is one more, a knight in plain armour, a knight who doesn't give his full name. It is Egg's older brother, Aemon, Prince Aemon Targaryen, a warrior of considerable skill, who has decided that honour matters more than dynasty, and that standing beside Duncan is the right thing to do regardless of what it costs him. And then, quietly, the truth about Egg comes out. Duncan learns who his squire really is, not just a stable boy, not just a wandering orphan. Aegon Targaryen, fourth son of Prince Maekar. Duncan is furious. He feels manipulated, made a fool of. He also knows that it is too late to do anything about it, because the trial of Seven begins at dawn. Section 7. Blood on the grass. The battle is brutal. 7 knights on each side, fighting in a confused melee rather than the orderly lines of a joust. In a real battle, you pick your fights where you can. You cover your allies. You watch for the man behind you. And sometimes the man behind you is wearing the same colors as you. Duncan fights hard. He is not technically skilled, not in the refined way that trained knights are, not with the elegance of a man raised to the tournament circuit. But he is enormous, and he is strong, and he does not stop. He absorbs punishment that would put other men down and keeps coming, and that stubbornness, that sheer refusal to fall, is itself a kind of weapon. But men do fall. On both sides, men fall. And one of the men who falls, one of the men who dies on that field, is Prince Baelor Breakspear. Baelor Targaryen, called Baelor Breakspear, is the eldest son of King Daeron II. He is widely considered the finest knight in the realm, and more than that, widely considered to be a good man, a prince worth following, a future king worth believing in. He rides to Ashford not to stand for either side in the trial, but to observe, to judge, to ensure fair play. And then in the chaos of the melee, a blow lands wrong. The details are uncertain in the telling. It may be that Maekar, in trying to strike at someone else, strikes his own brother. It may be accident. It may be something darker. But the blow falls and Baelor falls and does not rise again. The Crown Prince of Westeros dies in a meadow at a tournament because a hedge knight punched a prince over a puppeteer's painted fingers. This is not how history is supposed to work. This is not the kind of story that has neat lessons. Baelor Breakspear was not supposed to be there. He chose to come. He chose to stand in the light and be a witness to justice, and the cost of that choice was everything. Section 8. Aftermath and Departure. The trial of 7 ends. Aerian's side does not prevail in the judgment of the gods, or if they do, no one enforces it that way. The matter is settled in Duncan's favour, more or less, though settled is perhaps too clean a word for what happens. Aerian is sent into exile. Daeron the Drunk largely escapes consequence being too dim and too soft to inspire real anger. Duncan is alive, but the realm has lost Baelor Breakspear, and the men who stood with Duncan, some of them live, some of them don't, and none of them walk away unchanged. Duncan is knighted, properly, formally, by the lords who witnessed the trial, which resolves at least one question that had been nagging at the edges of the story from the beginning. He is now, officially, Ser Duncan the Tall. The hedge knight is real. There is a moment between Duncan and Egg, after everything, where the question of their partnership has to be renegotiated. Now that Duncan knows the truth, does it change things? Can he still be Egg's knight? He can. He does. Egg's father Maekar is furious, humiliated. His son's involvement in the trial is an embarrassment to the family. But there is nothing to be done about it now. Egg has chosen Duncan, and in his stubborn, princely way he's not going to unchoose him. And so they ride on, the hedge knight and the prince, the big man who doesn't know his own birthday, and the boy who knows exactly what he is and has decided to be something else for a while. Section 9. The Sworn Sword. Months pass. The road continues. The second Dunk and Egg story, called The Sworn Sword, picks up roughly a year later, and it takes our pair somewhere new, to the service of a small lord in the Reach, a man named Sir Eustace Osgrey. But before we talk about Eustace, we need to talk about the world they're riding through. The realm is in drought. It is a terrible, grinding drought, the kind that doesn't just make fields brown, but breaks communities, turns neighbors into enemies, kills the weak and makes the strong desperate. In the Reach, which is normally the most fertile land in Westeros, the sight of dry riverbeds and cracked earth is something close to apocalyptic, and over all of this hangs the shadow of something called the Blackfire Rebellion. The Blackfire Rebellion happened about 15 years before our story. It was another Targaryen civil war, not dragon against dragon this time, because the dragons were already gone, but man against man, claim against claim. Daemon Blackfire was the legitimized bastard son of King Aegon IV, a great warrior, beautiful and charismatic, who many believed deserved the throne more than the legitimate heir Daeron the Good. When Aegon IV gave Daemon the ancestral Valyrian steel sword Blackfire, a sword historically carried by kings, some read it as a statement of intent. War followed, and though the rebellion was eventually crushed and Daemon Blackfire killed at the Battle of the Redgrass Field, the grievance didn't die with him. The Blackfire line survived through his sons, living in exile across the narrow sea, and some in Westeros still believed, quietly, carefully, that the true Targaryen line sat in Essos, not on the Iron Throne. Eustace Osgrey is one of those people, not loudly, not dangerously by the standards of open rebellion, but Eustace is a broken old man whose house was shattered by the Blackfire Rebellion because he chose the wrong side. He lost his sons, he lost his lands. He lives now in a small holdfast called Standfast, cultivating his grievances alongside his meagre crops, still convinced that Daemon Blackfire was the truer king. This is who Duncan and Egg have sworn themselves to serve, temporarily, for a meal and a roof and modest wages. Section 10. The Widow of Coldmoat. Adjacent to Eustace's land, separated from it by a stream that barely deserves the name, especially in a drought, is the holding of Coldmoat, ruled by a woman called the Widow of Coldmoat. Her name is Lady Rohan Webber. Rohan is not what you expect. She is red-haired, fiercely intelligent, and surrounded by a reputation for ruthlessness that may or may not be entirely deserved. She has married and buried 4 husbands, which people have opinions about. She manages her lands with a competence that her neighbours resent. She has a long braid that she never cuts, and there are rumours about what the braid means and what she'll do to the man who cuts it. The dispute between Eustace and Rohan is, at its root, about water. The stream between their lands has dried to a trickle in the drought, and someone has dammed it on Rohan's side. Eustace believes she has done this deliberately to ruin him. He may be right, he may not be. Duncan is sent to negotiate. He is not a natural diplomat. He's large and earnest and says things directly in a world that prizes indirection. But he goes. What happens between Duncan and Rohan is one of the genuinely lovely threads in these stories. They are attracted to each other in a way that neither quite knows how to manage. She is sharper than him, and she knows it, but she doesn't condescend. He is more honest than she expects, and she finds it disarming. There is a scene where they talk across a creek bed, and there is a strange, tentative tenderness to it that feels earned in a way that romantic subplots in fantasy sometimes don't. But the situation is escalating around them whether they want it to or not. Section 11. The Ghost of the Red Grass Field. While Duncan is navigating the land dispute and his complicated feelings about Rohan, Egg is doing what Egg always does, paying attention, asking questions, and figuring things out faster than everyone around him expects. It is Egg who first understands the full depth of Eustace's loyalties. It is Egg who recognizes the weight of what it means that Eustace still grieves for the Blackfire cause 15 years on. And it is Egg who has to sit with the knowledge that the man he and Duncan serve is, in his heart, loyal to a rebel line and not to Egg's own family. This is one of the remarkable things about these stories. They use the perspective of the low-born Duncan to show us a Westeros that the great lords and kings never quite see. Eustace is not evil. He is not a monster. He is a tired old man who loved his sons and chose badly and has been paying for it ever since. And his loyalty to Demon Blackfire is less political philosophy and more personal grief, a way of honoring the sons who died for a cause by never entirely surrendering the cause. Duncan doesn't entirely understand this, but he feels it. He is better at feeling things than explaining them. The crisis comes when Eustace decides that rather than negotiate any further with Rohan, he will simply burn her crops, destroy what she has, make the drought worse by scorching what little is left. Duncan will not be part of this. He separates himself from Eustace's plan, and in doing so, he separates himself from his lord's service, because if you refuse your lord's command, you are no longer his sworn sword, and that is a boundary that matters enormously in this world. He goes instead to Coldmoat. Section 12. The Combat on the Bank. What follows is the story's climax, a duel between Duncan and Rohan's champion, the enormous knight Sir Lucas Inchfield, called the Long Inch for obvious reasons, though he is nowhere near as tall as Duncan. The fight is brief and ugly and real. It is not a joust. It is not the chivalric pageantry of Ashford. It is 2 men fighting in a dry creek bed, and someone is going to die. Duncan wins. He wins because he is stronger and because he doesn't flinch. And also, if we are being honest, because he has by now survived enough violence that he has learned a few things about how to survive more of it. Eustace is brought to heel, more or less. The water flows again. The immediate crisis resolves, but nothing is fully clean about the resolution. Eustace remains a broken man with broken loyalties, and Rohan must decide what to do with her lands and her life going forward. She offers Duncan something. She offers him essentially herself, a proposal that is practical more than romantic, but not without feeling. She needs a husband who can stand beside her and manage the expectations that the world places on a woman alone with power. She thinks Duncan could do that. Duncan says no, not cruelly. He is never cruel, but he says no. He is a hedge knight. He doesn't know how to be a lord. He doesn't know how to be a husband to someone like Rohan. Maybe someday he will figure out who he is, but not yet, and not here. Rohan lets him go. There is something in their final scene that neither of them quite says, which is that they might have been good together, and that the world has arranged itself so that they won't find out.
Dunk and Egg ride on.
Section 13. The Mystery Knight. The third story, The Mystery Knight, is the most complicated and the most politically dense of the three. It begins not with a tournament exactly, but with a wedding. The wedding of Sir Ambrose Butterwell, a minor lord of some means, to a Frey girl young enough to be his granddaughter. These things happen. It is Westeros. The wedding is to be accompanied by a small tournament, and it is happening in a place called White Walls, a new castle freshly built, gleaming and cold, and it draws, as tournaments do, knights from across the realm, except this particular tournament draws a very specific kind of knight. Men with secrets. Duncan and Egg arrive separately this time. Egg is disguised, as he sometimes is, his shaved head and common clothes concealing his origins. But they are not the only ones wearing masks, metaphorical or otherwise. The tournament at White Walls is crawling with mystery knights, competitors who ride under blank shields, giving no name and flying no sigil. There are enough of them to be strange, too many really. When you see that many people hiding their identities in one place, you have to wonder what they're all hiding from, and why they've all gathered here at the same time. Duncan begins to notice things, whispered conversations that stop when he walks by, men who watch each other too carefully, a general feeling that there is another game being played beneath the surface of the jousting. He is not wrong. Section 14. The Second Dance. The whispers Duncan keeps almost hearing are about a name, Demon the Second, or Demon Blackfire the Second, to be more precise, the son of the original rebel living in exile in Essos, the standard bearer for a renewed Blackfire claim. What is happening at White Walls, slowly, terrifyingly, as Duncan pieces it together, is a conspiracy. A second Blackfire rebellion is being planned. The wedding, the tournament, the gathering of mystery knights, these are the cover. The actual purpose is to assemble the men who will rise again under the Black Dragon banner in support of putting a Blackfire on the Iron Throne. Butterwell himself is involved. Many of the guests are involved. The tournament is a coordination meeting in elaborate disguise. This is catastrophically dangerous, not just politically, though it is that, but personally dangerous for Dunk and Egg. Because if Egg is recognized, the conspirators have a royal hostage of extraordinary value. Aegon Targaryen, grandson of the king, fourth son of Prince Maekar. His capture would give the Blackfire faction enormous leverage. Or they might simply kill him and send the head to King's Landing and call it a statement. Duncan figures this out gradually, imperfectly, in the way that a man who is smart but not quick figures things out. And then he acts, which is the one thing he is always consistently good at. Section 15. The Knight in the Shadows. One of the mystery knights at White Walls is a man called the Fiddler. He rides under a blank shield that shows very faintly a pattern that might be 3 castles. The arms of House Fiddleford, maybe, or perhaps something else entirely. The Fiddler is handsome and charismatic and impossibly sure of himself. He talks to Duncan with a kind of easy confidence, the confidence of a man who knows things other people don't. He speaks about destiny and crowns as though they are simply things that will happen to him, like weather. The fiddler is Demon Blackfyre II, or rather, Demon of House Blackfyre, son of the fallen rebel, carrying his father's claim and his father's fire. He is not, on a personal level, entirely unsympathetic. That is part of what makes these stories so interesting. The Blackfyre cause is wrong, or at least it has been decided that it is wrong, and in a world where power determines truth, that amounts to the same thing. But the people who hold the Blackfyre cause are not uniformly villains. They are people who believe in something, people who have organized their lives around a story of rightful inheritance and stolen crowns. Demon is one of those people. He believes, and his belief is not the sniveling excuse of a coward. It is the genuine conviction of a man who has been raised to see himself as a displaced king. But belief doesn't make him right, and the conspiracy he represents, if it succeeds, will burn more of Westeros. Duncan understands this. He is not a political thinker. He has no great theory of government or legitimacy. He just knows that another rebellion means more dead men in fields, more burnt villages, more orphans in alleys, and he has been one of those orphans, and he doesn't want to make more. Section 16. Egg Alone. There is a section of the Mystery Night that does something the earlier stories hadn't quite done. It puts Egg in genuine, unambiguous danger, without Duncan immediately available to pull him out. Egg is recognized, or close enough to recognize that it doesn't matter. He is confined, not violently but firmly, by men who understand exactly what he is worth. He is a bargaining piece, a prince wrapped in commoner's clothes, and the men who hold him are deciding what to do with him. What Egg does in this situation is quietly, methodically extraordinary. He doesn't panic, he doesn't beg. He talks to the men who hold him in the way that someone who has been raised to understand power speaks to people who think they have power, with a perfect, calm intelligence that never tips into arrogance. He listens, he watches, he waits. He is 10 years old, maybe 11, and he is the most controlled person in the room. This is who Egg is going to become later. We know this because we know the history. Egg will grow up to be Aegon V, King of the Seven Kingdoms. Aegon the Unlikely, they'll call him, because he was fourth in the succession and never expected to wear the crown. He will be, by most accounts, a good king, a reforming king, a king who remembered what it was to be a boy sleeping rough under the stars with a hedge knight who didn't know his own birthday. But that is later. Right now, he is a small boy in a room full of conspirators, and he is not afraid. Section 17. The King's Man in the Shadows. The conspiracy at White Walls does not succeed, and the reason it does not succeed is not entirely because of Duncan, though Duncan helps. The reason is that someone has been watching, someone with the authority and the power to arrest the conspirators on the spot, to dissolve the wedding tournament before it becomes a revolution. That someone is Lord Bloodraven. Bryndon Rivers, called Bloodraven, is the hand of the king. He is the bastard son of the old King Aegon IV, half-brother, therefore, to both Demon Blackfyre and to Daeron the Good, and he serves the Targaryen crown with an absolute, unsettling loyalty. He is an albino, marked by his pale hair and skin and the red eye that peers from beneath his scarred face. He is a sorcerer, some say, or at least someone who sees more than he should. He is also, unambiguously, good at his job, the job being preventing Westeros from tearing itself apart again. Bloodraven has been at White Walls the whole time, it seems, watching, waiting, letting the conspiracy develop far enough to identify all its participants, then closing it like a trap. Daemon the Second is taken, many of the conspirators are taken, the rebellion dies before it can draw its first real breath. And Bloodraven turns his single red eye on Duncan and Egg, and he is satisfied, or as satisfied as a man like Bloodraven gets, because Duncan's blundering, honest intervention helped flush the plot into the open. Sometimes you don't need to be subtle. Sometimes you just need someone enormous and sincere to walk into a room and make things happen. There is a conversation between Duncan and Bloodraven that is one of the great exchanges in these novellas. Bloodraven asks, in so many words, what Duncan believes about justice and loyalty and what a true knight is for. And Duncan gives his answers honestly, even knowing that Bloodraven is testing him, even knowing that Bloodraven could have him arrested or exiled or worse with a word. Bloodraven says something that sticks, that a man can be in two places at once if he knows where to look. It is cryptic. It is probably about his rumoured green sight, his ability to perceive events far away. Or it might be about something else entirely. The point is that it stays with Duncan, as a lot of things he doesn't entirely understand stay with him. Section 18. The World They Rode Through. Across 3 stories, the Hedge Knight, the Sworn Sword, and the Mystery Knight, Duncan and Egg ride through a Westeros that is in many ways more precarious than it looks. The Targaryen dynasty seems stable, the king is wise, the realm is largely at peace, but under the surface the fissures are everywhere. The black fire cause isn't dead. It will flare up again and again in the coming decades, as demons' sons and their descendants make renewed attempts on the throne. The drought is straining the reach. Minor lords nurse old grievances. The faith of the Seven sits uneasily with the old powers, and the great families, Lannister, Baratheon, Tully, Stark, are always watching, always calculating. What George R.R. Martin is doing in these stories, beneath the surface of the adventure, is building a portrait of institutional rot. Not spectacular rot, not the spectacular collapse of the Dance of the Dragons or the later catastrophes of the main series, but the slow, grinding erosion of a system that protects the powerful and grinds the powerless beneath it. Duncan sees this from the bottom. He has always been at the bottom. He knows what it costs to be poor and unnamed in a world that runs on names and blood. And he has decided, not through philosophy but through something more instinctive, that the order of chivalry is supposed to be better than this. That a true knight is supposed to protect those who cannot protect themselves, and that this idea is worth holding on to even when the world makes it very difficult. Egg sees it from somewhere more complicated. He is a prince. He will one day be a king. He has power that Duncan cannot imagine. But he has chosen, at age 10 or 11, to spend his formative years not in palaces and feast halls, but on dusty roads with a hedge knight, learning things that princes don't usually learn. He knows what it feels like to sleep on the ground. He knows what it feels like to be dismissed by someone who doesn't know who you are. These lessons will matter. Section 19. The Deeper Theme. Let's talk about what these stories are really about. On the surface, they are adventure stories, good ones. They are tightly plotted, warmly written, full of genuine tension and genuine humour. Martin's prose in these novellas is arguably more relaxed and pleasurable than in the main series. There is room to breathe, room for character, room for moments that don't immediately cascade into political consequence. But the deeper subject of Dunk and Egg is knighthood itself, what it means, what it costs, what it is for. The Westerosi order of chivalry is, like all such systems, deeply hypocritical in practice. Knights are supposed to protect the weak, to serve just lords, to fight honorably. In practice, knights do what they're paid to do, serve whoever holds their lease, and fight as dishonorably as they need to in order to survive. The vows are beautiful, the reality is not. Duncan knows this. He sees it constantly. He sees knights follow lords into injustice without protest. He sees men sworn to protect do exactly the opposite. He sees the system serve itself rather than the people it claims to serve. And what he decides, not consciously, not as a thesis, but in the way he acts, in the choices he makes when the choices are difficult, is that the ideal is worth something even when the practice falls short. That saying what a knight should be is not meaningless just because knights often aren't that thing. This is Martin doing something interesting with what is often considered a naive fantasy trope, the heroic knight in service of the weak. He doesn't satirize it or deconstruct it into nihilism. He takes it seriously. He asks what it would actually cost someone to try to live it. And his answer is, it costs quite a lot. It costs you comfortable situations and profitable alliances and sensible decisions. It costs you Rohan. It costs you safety. But it also gives you something. It gives you Egg, who is worth more than most knights have or ever will. It gives you the ability to look at yourself in still water and see someone you recognize. Duncan is not a great man, in the sense that history records great men. He will not lead armies or change dynasties. But he is a good one, in the sense that counts when you're Tansel and someone is standing on your hands, or you're a hedge knight who needs someone to stand beside you, or you're a prince who needs to learn that the world is larger and more complicated than any throne can contain. Section 20. The Futures That Were and Weren't. We know how this story ends because George R.R. Martin has told us, not in the novellas themselves, which remain in the middle of the tale, but in references scattered through the main series. Egg grows up. He becomes King Aegon V, the unlikely king, who takes the throne after a succession crisis leaves him as the only viable option. He rules for decades and is remembered as a reforming monarch who genuinely tried to use power to improve the lives of common people. Inspired, perhaps, by what he learned in those years on the road with Duncan. Duncan grows up too. He rises from hedge knight to Lord Commander, the Lord Commander of the King's Guard, the most prestigious military appointment in the Seven Kingdoms. He serves the king he once squired for. They grow old together, the king and his knight. And then they die together at a place called Summerhall. The tragedy of Summerhall is one of the great offstage disasters in Martin's world. We don't know the full details. It is hinted at in the main series, referenced by characters who weren't there and only heard the aftermath. But what we know is this. King Aegon V was obsessed with restoring dragons to the world, believing that without dragons the Targaryens were merely human and the world was poorer for it. He attempted some kind of great magical working at his palace of Summerhall. Something went catastrophically wrong. The palace burned. Many died, including the king himself.
And Duncan was there.
The hedge knight who punched a prince over a puppeteer's painted fingers, the man who stood in 7 trials when wiser men would have bent their knee, the Lord Commander of the King's Guard who grew up in Flea Bottom and never entirely stopped being a boy who wasn't sure of his own birthday. He died at Summerhall. Martin has said he intends to write more Dunk and Egg stories, bringing the pair forward through time, through the Blackfire rebellions that continue, through the events that lead toward the world of the main series. Whether those stories will arrive remains to be seen. What we have are three windows into a world that was passing even as Duncan and Egg rode through it. Section 21. Why these stories matter. There is a temptation, when discussing anything adjacent to A Song of Ice and Fire, to measure it by the yardstick of the main series, to ask what it reveals about the lore, what it establishes about the families, what it tells us about the events of later centuries. And yes, these stories do all of those things. They are the seedbed of characters and events that echo through the later history of Westeros. Bloodraven, the weirwood-bound green seer who becomes the three-eyed crow of the main series. The Blackfire Rebellion, whose aftershocks shape the reign of the Mad King and the world Robert inherits. The tragedy of Summerhall, which shadows the birth of Rhaegar Targaryen and everything that comes after. But that is not why these stories matter. That is not why they are worth spending an hour with. They matter because of Duncan, because of a boy from Flea Bottom who decided against all evidence that the oath he'd never technically taken was still binding, who believed that a true knight protects the weak, even when the weak are puppeteers and the strong are princes, who went his whole life without quite figuring out where he fit in the world, but kept moving through it with such stubbornness and such honesty that the world eventually made a place for him anyway. He is not a hero of the kind that fantasy usually celebrates. He is not clever. He is not noble. He does not have a destiny written in the stars or a sword chosen by fate. He is a large, earnest, often confused man who keeps trying to do right even when right is expensive and uncomfortable and seems, frankly, like the wrong tactical choice. Egg matters too, because Egg chose Duncan, could have chosen comfort, could have stayed in palaces, could have learned power from men who already had it. Instead, he chose a hedge knight who didn't know his own birthday and the road and the world as it actually is, rather than as kings are told it is. That choice shaped him. Maybe it shaped the kingdom. In the end, the tale of Dunk and Egg is a story about two people who were good for each other in a world that wasn't always good to either of them. The knight needed the prince to teach him that the world was larger than it looked from the bottom. The prince needed the knight to teach him that the world was harder than it looked from the top. Together, they learned something that neither could have figured out alone. And then they died at Summerhall, and the world continued without them, as it always does. But for a few hundred pages, for three stories told in a gentler key, in a Westeros before the worst of it, they rode together through dust and drought and conspiracy and trial by combat, and it was, despite everything, good. And that brings us to the end of the story of Dunk and Egg, the adventures of a hedge knight and his young squire, whose journeys would echo through the history of the Seven Kingdoms. Though their story begins with simple travels along the roads of Westeros, the lives of Ser Duncan the Tall and Egg would eventually become part of the greater history of the realm. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the story and lore behind these characters, be sure to subscribe and join us for more explorations into the legends, histories, and hidden stories of the worlds we love. And until next time, farewell.